you live in any one of these countries, something fundamental may be about to happen to you. The Treaty on European Union signed in Maastricht last year is due to be ratified by all EC members. Some people see this as a great leap forward for Europe. Others think it represents the start of a process that could whittle away your very identity.
We should decide it for ourselves. So the importance of this meeting is to affirm our rights to choose and determine what is the nature of our Constitution.
This small but determined crowd, demanding a national referendum before the UK ratifies the treaty, was in little doubt of how they saw the threat. Even in Maastricht, the very town where the treaty was signed, we found doubt, a different sort of doubt. Students from all over the continent, basically enthusiastic about European unity, were gathering in a mood of some uncertainty to discuss what it would all mean for them.
The issue is so complex. I'm here to obtain some inside stories.
Don't have a real chance to get real information about the treaty.
We are young people, I know, we are only students, but it depends on us how the future of Europe will be worked out.
The students were given a keynote address by Piet Dankert, the Dutch Minister for Europe and one of the architects of the Maastricht Treaty.
Maastricht broadly maps out the next stage.
In working groups, they looked in detail at the questions raised by Maastricht. And they are not the only ones trying to work out precisely what sort of Europe the treaty would create. At the European newspaper in London, journalists are discussing public opinion findings with editor Charles Garside. The question of Maastricht is never far from our minds, and it's my job as associate editor to see how we should cover the debate. We run regular articles by the key players, and we recently produced the booklet, Maastricht Made Simple, now into its second printing. We have been in little doubt that those who set the Maastricht process going and pushed the treaty through to signature got out of step with the majority of people around Europe. Now, this didn't necessarily have anything to do with the strengths or weaknesses of the treaty, but the failure to explain to ordinary people what it was all about came close to undermining not only Maastricht, but the whole painstaking business of European cooperation. So how did we all get ourselves into such a mess? I think the answer can be found in the events that took place here in November 1989. After 2 generations of stability with the Cold War and the nuclear balance between East and West, Europe found itself confronted by change, real dramatic change, a change with its own momentum that threatened to go out of the control of politicians. No one could be confident of the outcome. For Europe has historically been a dangerous place, its warring tribes destroying themselves and each other with bloody regularity through the centuries. After the Second World War, the countries at the heart of Europe tried to break that cycle. In pooling their coal and steel industries within a few years of the war, France, Germany, Italy and the Benelux countries started to create a European common market. The Treaty of Rome in 1957 was mainly about economic matters, but there was no doubt then that the purpose and the long-term destiny were deeply political. Some likened the community that was being created to a young sapling which might one day develop into a mighty tree, casting shade and protection over the continent and promoting, in the words of the Treaty of Rome, an ever closer union. And a wave of new members joined the community as the years passed. Country after country from northern and southern Europe that wanted to share in the extraordinary economic success of the European community. And, by 1987, the EC countries had agreed to create one single market, the largest internal market in the world, even bigger than the United States of America. But President Mitterrand of France and Chancellor Kohl of Germany, 2 leaders who saw themselves as being at the cockpit of European unity, wanted to go further, developing this single market into a new economic union with its own currency. And with the fall of the Berlin Wall, they saw the chance to achieve even more than that, a politically united Europe to rise from the ruins of the Cold War. With the support of European Commission President Jacques Delors, they now set about persuading other EC leaders that Europe could be a beacon of stability and wealth in the new world order. It was in the Dutch town of Maastricht that the marathon round of negotiations which followed reached its climax. Maastricht is the home of the carnival tradition in Northern Europe. Now it became the arena for the different EC governments to see if, despite their often diverging interests, they could negotiate the future of Europe. It was in this chamber that they eventually reached agreement on what became the Treaty of European Union. Everyone assumed that once negotiated, the deal they'd agreed in the corridors here would stick, and that would be that. All around the community, national parliaments would ratify the treaty, and that would be the end of the whole business. But they left one thing out of their calculations. That was the people. The Danes were the first to be asked what they thought, since there had to be a referendum under Danish law before the treaty could be ratified. By a slim majority, they threw it out. They felt they'd been taken for granted. They didn't understand the treaty. They didn't trust the politicians who had taken the big decisions on their behalf without consulting them. The Danish result reflected similar misgivings all around Europe. The Irish were convinced in the course of a long referendum campaign that they should say yes to the treaty, as a strongly pro-European country which had received heavy financial funding from Brussels. But in France, the country which more than any other could claim to be at the heart of the community, there was a bitter and emotional campaign, with a strong counterattack by the noes.
Pour la France, vous ne pouvez pas nous laisser mourir.
The treaty was saved. 51% in favour.
The ayes to the right, 319. The noes to the left, 316.
And in the British House of Commons, the government managed only a 3-vote majority when it proposed simply to introduce the ratification bill to the House. So the treaty survived, by a whisker, to fight another day. The central problem is that Maastricht, like every other great leap forward in EC history, was promoted and negotiated by the elites, by idealists, businessmen and government officials meeting behind closed doors. There's always been a strong and coherent Brussels vision of how the EC tree should grow, an organic one of new branches, deeper roots and expansion into new areas. The enthusiasts, particularly those working at the European Commission, saw it developing into a mighty political and economic power, a United States of Europe. But some governments, particularly Britain, doubted if their people were ready for this approach, which seemed to give the process a life of its own. They wanted it to be more controlled, and in the course of the negotiation, an alternative approach emerged, the pillar approach. This saw Europe as more of a building than a tree, to be constructed according to precise architectural plans, one pillar for cooperation on foreign and security affairs, another for home affairs and justice. Whatever happened, the member states, not the European Commission, were to be in charge. And that is the Maastricht Treaty as it ended up, an uneasy combination of the community tree and the new pillared responsibilities brought together under the roof of the European Union. And to give people a stake in this union, the idea of European citizenship was born. Rather the way people from Kansas to California see themselves as US citizens, so these people in the marketplace in Maastricht would remain Dutch, but they would also be citizens of the new European Union. And that's easy to imagine in Maastricht, a town at the meeting point of 3 countries and within striking distance of 3 more. A regular visitor is Wilma Roma, who lives in Belgium, sends her children to school in Holland, and does her Christmas shopping in Germany. The Roma family are Dutch, but a few years ago they moved to a bigger house in Belgium. The family all travel to Holland every day. Mr. Roma works near Maastricht and crosses the border at the end of the road on his way to the office. 15-year-old Jacko cycles to school in Maastricht, and his sister Femke goes in by scooter. And Wilma herself goes there every week to do her shopping. But she told me that all this international living didn't erode her sense of national identity. It rather enhanced it.
When I feel Dutch, I'm Dutch, and when I feel Belgium, I'm Belgian. For me, I feel European.
There would also be some very practical benefits to European citizenship. Any citizen who felt he or she had been ill-used by a European institution could appeal to a new community ombudsman, a sort of popular troubleshooter. If I lived here in Maastricht as a British subject, I would be able to vote for members of the city council and for the local member of the European Parliament. For many people, however, that's just not the point. At this candlelit vigil recently outside number 10 Downing Street in London, people certainly didn't feel so effortlessly European.
I do not want to be a European citizen. I want to be a British citizen. I want a British passport, and I just do not want to be called a citizen.
What bothers me about citizenship is that there are duties which go with that, and there's a duty to the rulers of the new European superstate.
In the end, only the people themselves can decide whether European citizenship would undermine their traditional loyalties, or whether it might just serve to enrich their existing national identities. Another vital fruit of the European Union under Maastricht would be the single currency, the ECU, within the framework of economic and monetary union, EMU. I've just changed £100 sterling into German marks. They gave me 238 marks, but then charged me an additional 11 marks for the privilege. Now, if I were to repeat the trick, going around every country in the community, changing my pounds into marks, marks into francs, and so on, I'd end up with about half of what I started with, about £50. All of that would change under EMU, and there wouldn't be much of a future for a bureau de change like this one. Those who support the single currency believe it would also transform the commercial life of the continent, with huge gains from trading in one money across frontiers. More than that, they believe it would be possible to achieve all around Europe the levels of prosperity that Germany has achieved with its economic miracle. But to do that, all countries would need to organize their economies the way the Germans do. With the high productivity of its leading firms like BMW motorcycles, Germany became the very model of the modern industrial economy. But the ability of its companies to stay ahead of the competition depended on having the right economic framework. That meant a stable currency, low inflation, and low levels of debt. So under the plans agreed at Maastricht, Europe's governments would try to operate their economies in a similar way in the 1990s. At the end of this period, those countries which were economically strong enough would entrust their monetary affairs to a European central bank. This would be managed rather like Germany's Bundesbank at present, in a way that would be broadly independent of governments. And their national currencies would be replaced by the ECU. Ironically, the opponents of EMU also looked to Germany, pointing out that economic and monetary union there just under 3 years ago was disastrous for industry in the East. Osthafen-Mühlen Enterprises used to be one of the great industrial conglomerates in East Berlin, its 350 workers processing all the grain for bread deliveries around the region. Now it's reduced to a flour mill employing just 46 workers. That's because under unification, most of the complex was too inefficient to compete with the more up-to-date producers of the West. Soon after the Deutschmark replaced the East German Ostmark, the old company, like 80% of East German industry, went bankrupt. Some 300 workers lost their jobs, and the barges which used to ferry grain all around Berlin now lie idle. Even the critics of monetary union agree that East Germany will eventually recover, and there'll be new firms to offer jobs to the unemployed workers. So East Germans can be expected to pull their weight within a united Germany. They are Germans after all. But how much more difficult it would be for the Spaniards or the Portuguese or the Greeks, with their very different economies and societies, to adapt to the full rigors of monetary union. How difficult indeed for the British. They have always been the most sceptical about EMU, and while the poorer member states put their hopes in special cohesion funds to help tide them over, Britain negotiated an opt-out, permitting it to decide only later whether to join. The Danish government have now negotiated something similar. The high standard of working conditions on the continent also gave the British government a problem in the social chapter of the Maastricht Treaty. The idea of minimum standards across the community was very important to the other member states, but the UK government was worried that too generous conditions would make Europe's industries and Britain's uncompetitive. It was only by allowing Britain to opt out on this whole question that agreement at Maastricht was possible. So both on EMU and the social chapter, two vital elements in the treaty, there's less than unanimity. Right now, EMU in particular doesn't look very promising, given the currency turmoil of the past few months. But each of the 12 is trying to sort out its economy on the EMU principles of low inflation and low borrowing. For many people, EMU remains the cutting edge of Maastricht, but it's for the citizens of Europe to decide if they want to be part of it. Let's look at the first of the new pillars of the Union, for what are called Home Affairs and Justice. That means drugs, refugees, and a host of problems that individual countries can't deal with on their own, like crime. As things stand now, the Dutch police can chase a suspected criminal as far as the Belgian border. Once there, they have to rely on their Belgian colleagues to have a chance of catching their man. All this is about to change.
In April of this year, the legal borders here between Belgium, Germany and Holland are vanishing. Forces in Germany, Holland and Belgium will coordinate better, so therefore it's a possibility for us to get the criminals more easily.
Under this arrangement, the criminals wouldn't manage to escape the way they did in this exercise. What the Dutch, the Belgians and the Germans are doing is bringing forward between themselves the sort of cooperation envisaged under Maastricht. Even the opponents of Maastricht don't get too hot under the collar about the Home Affairs pillar. This is essentially government-to-government cooperation, with only a limited role for Brussels. But they do worry that if sensitive questions like crime, immigration and refugees are brought under any sort of EC umbrella, the pressure will be on to take all the big decisions in Brussels. And they say this could be the thin end of the wedge. This argument applies all the more to the next of the pillars, which aims to create a common foreign and security policy for the EC. On dangerous and complicated questions like the war in what was Yugoslavia, the thinking at Maastricht was that the community countries must learn to work as more of a unit if they were to be a more effective force in the world, rather than always arriving too late on the scene. On a problem like Yugoslavia, the member states would agree early on that this demanded joint action. All 12 would plan together and react together, so that any potential aggressor would get a clear, unified EC response. In time, they would be able to intervene militarily as well as diplomatically, with European soldiers like the French peacekeepers in Bosnia operating under a community flag. The critics say this is all very well, but when serious questions of national interest are involved, from fisheries to firearms, the member states will go their own way. Others, in contrast, fear that there will be irresistible pressure to create a full-blown European army. The supporters say this is all alarmist, and that the habit of cooperation will develop gradually over a long period as member states get used to working together. What about the other branches growing in the European community tree? Maastricht does extend the remit of the community into many new areas in the life of the continent, like education, culture and consumer protection. As things stand now, if I buy a computer game in this Dutch electronics shop, take it back to Britain and discover when I get there that it doesn't work,
I'll probably have to come all the way back to the Netherlands to trade it in or get a refund. Even if there's a British dealership or depot, they are under no legal obligation to help me out in Britain.
Under Maastricht, Brussels would have the power to act on consumer issues like this. Yet on these delicate legal questions, countries tend to protect their national sovereignty. For some people, it all reeks of Brussels interfering in the nooks and crannies of national life. It was this fear of unjustified interference from Brussels that brought the word subsidiarity into Maastricht. The idea being that where things could be done just as well at the level of the member state, then the branches should be pruned back and Brussels should not be allowed to take action. For instance, who should decide if these Italian beaches, refused an environmental approval flag by the European Commission, are clean enough, Rome or Brussels? Who has the last word on whether pornographic pictures can be broadcast into your home by satellite across national borders, the EC or your national government? This debate about subsidiarity, who does what, is really part of a bigger question. Who's in charge? Under Maastricht, the European Commission, which proposes all EC legislation, receives new powers, not only in the new areas of the tree, but also in coordinating the two new pillars and EMU. The European Parliament, allowed to debate only a few subjects at present, also gains, with a new co-decision procedure strengthening its oversight of the Commission. But the European Council of Ministers from the Member States is the biggest gainer, with tighter control of the Commission and the lead role in the pillars for home and foreign affairs. Yet conferring new powers on the politicians and the Eurocrats gives many people the uneasy feeling that maybe the EC isn't there for them after all. It also highlights the idea that there's a democratic deficit at the heart of the community, a lack of accountability to the people. The European Parliament, with its 500-odd directly elected representatives, certainly expressed its own concern that Maastricht was not democratic enough, but on balance it voted to support the treaty as a step in the right direction. The relationship between the Parliament, the Commission and the Council of Ministers is the vital thing, according to a past President of the European Parliament, Piet Dankert.
Democratic deficit is an eternally discussed problem. In the communities, it's a very special one in the sense that there is one powerhouse, that's the Council of Ministers. And if you can't check that powerhouse by way of the Commission, helped by the European Parliament, you are in a system of intergovernmental negotiations, basically, which for national parliaments is not really to control. So in order to get it open, to have external influences on it, you need a Commission, and the Commission, in order to be politically standing up, needs the European Parliament. It's a question of balance, basically.
Others say that it's only national parliaments and national governments that have real legitimacy. So if Maastricht strengthens Brussels in any way, it must be undemocratic.
I profoundly believe the Maastricht Treaty is not a good treaty. I think there have been three major assaults on democratic and accountable government in this century. One is communism, the second is fascism, and the third is this bureaucratic, non-democratic and non-accountable rule that's set up in Maastricht. I think it's a very wrong direction for Europe to be taking, and the treaty should fail on the democratic grounds alone.
Curiously, many of the treaty's champions agree that there's a lot wrong with it.
It's an awful treaty. You can't read it, it's impossible to understand. It goes in different directions. Nevertheless, it's a good treaty in the sense that it tries on the internal market to make definite our cooperation by putting monetary union on top of it. What happened in '89, the falling apart of the Soviet Empire and its consequences in Central and Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia included. I mean, we have to find ways and means to develop a common foreign and security policy, because if we don't, we risk falling apart as well ourselves.
But what do our students from across Europe think at the end of their conference? Have any of their doubts been dispelled? We talked to them as they celebrated in some style on the River Maas.
As Europe, we have a very thorough credibility crisis when we watch television every night and we see Sarajevo and Bosnia, and nothing is happening. I mean, that's where the fate of the Maastricht Treaty is decided. It's there. It's not in the referenda which are coming up later this year.
It's a problem when the decision making is shifted from national level to supranational level, and the democratic control isn't guaranteed enough.
I see that it's difficult, but I don't know what the other solution is right now. It's the only one we have to work with.
Who can tell how the energies and idealism of this generation and of the next can best be harnessed for the good of Europe? There are strong arguments for saying the Maastricht Treaty is overcomplicated, inward-looking, even undemocratic. Yet there's good reason for saying that national solutions are no longer up to the international problems and opportunities which confront us. Maastricht may not be perfect, but might it just be better than no response at all?
In the end, between all the problems there have been across Europe, especially in Denmark and the United Kingdom, no one can tell you for sure whether Maastricht deserves to go through or not. The decision can only be yours. Our only prejudice is that the European community will only flourish if it has the support of Europe's peoples. Those who believe in Maastricht simply need to demonstrate that the treaty deserves that support, that it can be a step forward, and that the answer to the question, who's in charge, will ultimately be the people.